The JCC is committed to giving our community the opportunity to hear a variety of perspectives on current events. However, we do want you to know that the views and opinions expressed by our session leaders do not necessarily reflect the official position of the JCC. The JCC is also committed to giving our community the opportunity to hear a variety of perspectives on current events. However, we want to add, and we also are committed to civil discourse. And we want to let you know that the chat is open, that you can feel free to enter your comments and feedback, but we ask you to please be civil. And so I am very excited to reintroduce tonight's presenter, Ittay Flescher. Ittay is the education director at Kids for Peace Jerusalem, an interfaith movement for Israelis and Palestinians. And he is also Israel correspondent for Plus 61J Media. He also frequently teaches on gap year programs about the identity, narratives, and culture of the people who call Jerusalem home. Ittay, welcome back. I look forward to hearing your session.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. As you can hear from my accent, I grew up in Australia, probably with Jerry Lotterman's family, I'm guessing, and I made Jerusalem my home 3 years ago, and since then I've been working as both a journalist and an educator. I wish I could be with you in New York in person, not here, not in a country that's at war at the moment. It's a very difficult time for many Israelis over the past week, and I'm very much praying for peace. I'm praying for a ceasefire and hope that as much as possible, no more lives are lost from this terrible conflict. I will begin by talking a little bit about. By the way, if you want to follow Classics 1J, you can do so on Facebook there, and you can read all of our updates there. So I want to begin by talking tonight about protests. The reason I thought to do this topic was I've been teaching about Israel my whole life as a high school teacher, and I've done many courses on Israeli society through music, Israeli society through poetry, through literature, through movies. And something that really struck me over the past year was that Israelis love to protest. Like every Saturday night, there is a protest in this country in many different cities, right, left, Jewish, Arab, socialist, capitalist, you name it. Like we're a very protesting nation. And I thought it would be interesting to tell this history of this country rather than through poetries or through wars or, other means as most educators do, to tell this history of the country just through the lens of people who protested. And so I wrote a 6-week course about this question. And what I'm going to deliver tonight is the first of 6 lectures, but just to give you a taste of what I do in the course and to talk about the notion of protest as an Israeli value. So I want to begin with a quote from David Grossman, who is a very well-known Israeli author, Israel Prize winner, also sadly a bereaved parent. He lost his son, Uli, in the Lebanon War. And he once wrote this column about why he goes to a lot of protests. And it says in English, he says, maybe Cheryl, I can get you to read this. You've got a lovely reading voice.
All right, I will read. David Grossman's on why Israeli protest. Each time I go to a demonstration or need to write a political article, I think of the man who stood for years and demonstrated against the Vietnam War in front of the White House. For years, every Friday, he stood there for his 2 hours holding a sign. Eventually, a reporter approached him and, somewhat embarrassed, asked, "Tell me, sir, do you really think you could change the world?" The man answered, "No. I am just making sure that the world doesn't change me." Sometimes this is the most we can wish ourselves at a twisted, distorted time such as this.
Thank you, Cheryl. So the person that he's talking about is a man named A.J. Must. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with him. He was a pacifist who was one of the first people to protest against the Vietnam War, and obviously later on millions of Americans joined him in those protests leading to America to withdraw from that war. But there are many people around the world that start these one-person protests that lead to millions. Greta Thunberg is probably another example, a 15-year-old girl in Sweden in 2018 protesting on Fridays, leading to millions. protesting about climate change around the world now. There's a man who I've interviewed, actually, named Andrew. He won't say his last name, but he protests every Wednesday outside the Chinese embassy in London about China's intention of the Uyghur Muslims. Again, a one-man protest. There's about 20 people there now, but still very small. But this notion of I don't believe that I can necessarily change the views of China or the views of the US on the Vietnam War or those sorts of things, but protesting is something that I do for my own moral conscience. And the protest I want to look at today, actually, to me, is a protest I don't think many people know about, but I think says something fundamental about Israel and its relationship to the Holocaust. And it's a protest that happened in the 1950s. And it was to do with the reparations from the Holocaust. So just a bit of context. Between 1945 and 1951, 100,000 survivors of Nazi death camps made Aliyah and made Israel their home. And Israel says quite explicitly that the state of Israel will be the home for all Jewish immigration of all the exiles from Europe. And the cost of this resettlement, not just of these Holocaust survivors, but obviously Jews that came from all over the world, cost about $3,000 per person, which was $1.5 billion in total. And at the time, the newly found state of Israel didn't have that sort of money, but very much wanted to resettle all of these Jewish refugees. At the same time, over $6 billion worth of Jewish property had been pillaged and looted by the Nazis during World War II. And so what happened was there was demand for reparations from the Federal Republic of Germany in the autumn of 1949. And the demand came from both, mainly from the Allied powers, mainly from the US. And they said to Germany, look, if you want to be part of the family of nations, if you want to end the US occupation of your country, because Germany was still occupied by the Allies at that time, then you need to make amends for the horrors that you caused during World War II. And part of that means to make amends will be to pay reparations to the people you harmed, and namely the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And there was a lot of debate around this idea at the time, because the state of Israel gets only a few years old at the time. And there's a question of, does the state of Israel even represent the Jewish people? Because at the time, the vast majority of Jews did not live in the state of Israel. And then the second thing, and that's the focus of these protests really, is can you actually receive money for a Holocaust? Like, how can you make amends for killing 6 million people? Like, some would say it's an obscene question. Like, there's no amount of money that can ever absolve someone of the guilt of committing such a horrific genocide. And so why accept this money? Why do anything to make the Germans feel better? And in fact, the German word for reparation, Wiedergutmachung, is it means to make good again. And a lot of Jews felt like, we don't want to make good again with the Germans, with the Nazis, 5 years after World War II. And so there was a real debate in Hebrew, should you call this money shilomim, which is payments, or pitzuim? And eventually, in Israel, it became normal to call it shilomim, payments, because pitzuim, to call it reparations, was too hard a word to use. And in 1951, the Chancellor of Germany, he said that unspeakable crimes have been committed in the name of the German people, calling for moral and material indemnity. The federal government have prepared, jointly with representatives of Jewry in the state of Israel, to bring about a solution to material indemnity, thus easing the way for the spiritual settlement of infinite suffering. Nachul Goldman, at the time, who was the chair of the Jewish Agency, said he established an organization called the Claims Conference, which I believe the JCC in Manhattan probably receives money from as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, Cheryl. But the Claims Conference has the task of negotiating with the German government a program of indemnification of material damages to Jewish individuals and Jewish people caused by the Holocaust. So, should Israel accept this money or not? So, in the case of the people who were for accepting this money, were people from the Mapai, which was the left wing, the Socialist Party in Israel, led by David Ben-Gurion. And he said there are two approaches. One is the ghetto Jews approach, and the other is the approach of an independent people. Our plan will recover as much Jewish property as possible. Not atonement for sins. Reparations are needed to finance the absorption and rehabilitation of Holocaust survivors in Israel. There's a short window of opportunity. If we don't take this money now, we don't know if Germany will move into the communist bloc, and then they won't want to give these reparations anyway. Now that they're open to make these payments, we need these payments to establish our state. We don't have money to do this. We're a very poor country. We're under attack. We're at war. This is the time to do it. On the other hand, Yaakov Chazan of the Mapam said that Nazism is rearing its ugly head again in Germany, and so-called Western friends are nurturing Nazism and resurrecting Nazi Germany. Our army will be in the same camp as the Nazi army, and the Nazis will begin infiltrating here, not as our most terrible enemies, but as our allies. And so there was a real concern of rehabilitating Nazi Germany so shortly after World War II. David Ben-Gurion said ultimately that the decision to negotiate reparations with Germany is part of the price that a Jewish state must pay for sovereignty. Difficult obligations that could be avoided in the diaspora must be fulfilled when Jews are a free and sovereign people. Moshe Sharet, who also supported the reparations from Germany, he argued that there's a famous story in the Tanakh, and I know it's Shavuot, so it's probably appropriate that we learn a bit of Tanakh. That there's a story called the vineyard of Navot, Kerem Navot. And according to the book of Kings, Navot was executed by Queen Jezebel so that her husband Ahab could possess Navot's vineyard. After the execution, Elijah says to Achav, "Have you murdered and also taken possession?" And that line, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta, is what Moshe Sharet used to say to the Germans. He said, "You've already murdered us. You've already destroyed 6 million lives and 1.5 million children's lives. Should you also then inherit our property and our wealth and our art and all of these things? No, you've committed the murder. Don't let the murderer also benefit from the murder." That was the argument, and that's an argument that actually appealed to many Jewish Israelis, because they felt that this was a way to sort of, it doesn't, absolve Germany in any way of the guilt of the Holocaust, but it does in some way fix a historic wrong that all this Jewish property that was looted, they shouldn't be able to hold on to that forever without paying any reparations. Against this agreement, probably the most vocal voice against this was Menachem Begin. He was the leader of the Irgun, which is a pre-state militia. The British considered the Irgun a terrorist organization. He was also part of the Herut party. The Irgun organized many actions against both Arab and British forces in Palestine pre-1948 in what they considered to be a struggle for liberation, to create a Jewish state. Menachem Begin himself was wanted by the British police as a terrorist. That's how they viewed him due to the actions that he undertook at that time. And in 1948, Herut was the main sort of right-wing nationalist party. It was an adherent of what's called revisionist Zionism, and Herut said basically, we don't want to sit with. So Ben-Gurion famously said, "I will never sit with the Herut and I will never sit with Maki. I won't sit with the communists and I won't sit with the revisionists." And so we have this situation where the question of these reparations is something that Ben-Gurion very desperately wants and Menachem Begin desperately doesn't want. And there was eventually a rally held, and this is the crux of this lecture, what happened at this rally, because I think it also relates to what's happening today. And what happened there was that Menachem Begin stood on the balcony in Kikar Tzion in Jerusalem, and he said the following. He said, "Our honor shall not be sold for the blood, our honor shall not be sold for money, our blood shall not be atoned by goods, we shall wipe out this disgrace." So there's no way that in 1952, a Jewish state can accept money from Nazis. This is a disgrace, it's a horrible thing, and there's no way we should entertain this as an idea. He went on to say that when the Haganah fired on us with their cannons, I gave the order no, referring to the Altalena. Today, I give the order yes. This will be a war of life or death. Go and surround the Knesset as in the days of Rome, and the Romans wanted to set up an idol in the Holy Temple. The Jews came from all corners of the country, surrounded and saying, over our dead bodies. So he's essentially telling his supporters to go and give their lives, to storm the Knesset, storm the parliament of Israel, and to do whatever they can to prevent the Knesset from voting to accept these reparations from Germany. On January the 7th, 1952, you can see all the people that he's speaking to at this rally. You can see that police blocked adjacent roads. There was roadblocks and wire fences were set up around the building. The IDF was prepared to suppress the insurrection. The rally grew. There was 15,000 people there. Many of the protesters actually wore yellow stars. That's how against this reparations agreement they were. They eventually started throwing stones at the Knesset, smashing windows. After 5 hours of rioting, the police took control of the situation with tear gas, and you can see the anger here of the young men who were protesting, and a lot of them were holding signs that says things like Dachau and remember Treblinka and remember and don't forget, remember Auschwitz. Mapam MK Hanan Reuben was actually injured after a stone was thrown at him inside the Knesset, inside the parliament of Israel. And then Menachem Begin got into the Knesset and gave this speech because he was a MK at the time. He said, to this Knesset, I say there are things in life that are worse than death. We will give our lives, we will give our families, we will say goodbye to our children. We will not accept money from Germany. I know that you, Ben Gurion, have power. You have prison camps and army police. I know that you can drag me off to a concentration camp. We will sit together with them necessary. We will die together, but we will never accept reparations from Germany. The vote eventually gets up 61 to 50. There are 9 abstentions. So the majority of the Knesset does want these reparations, and they are signed in 1952. And as a result of this, Menachem Begin is suspended from the Knesset for this insurrection. For 3 months, he's not allowed to enter the Knesset. From then on, Ben Gurion actually never ever refers to Menachem Begin by name. He always calls him the man sitting next to Knesset member Beda. And then after losing 9 elections, incredibly in 1977, Menachem Begin became Prime Minister of Israel, defeating the Mapai, bringing the Likud to power. And then since 1970, with the exception of about 6 years, Likud have been in power ever since. So what I want to do now is I want to pause what I've said up until now and ask you, what do you think of this protest? What do you think of the vehemence in which Menachem Begin and David Ben Gurion argued their case? Which side do you think you would have been on? And what can we learn about Israel from this, delving into this moment of history? What do we take from, what do you take at least from this moment about the character of the Jewish state? And I'll come to today in a minute, but just looking at this past, what feelings come up for you hearing these arguments about reparations? So if anyone wants to speak now, you can, I think, maybe raise your hand, and then Cheryl will be able to unmute you.
If you want to raise your hand, that would be helpful if you could use the hand raise function in Zoom, just because many of you don't have your cameras on, so I won't otherwise know if you're raising your hand.
Yeah, so blood money is exactly what Begin called it in response to Sandy's question. And today, you know, I don't know where Israel would be without that money, but at that time it was very controversial to accept.
So I'm going to call on Michael.
So my question is, I know, and maybe I missed it, but later on in time, there are a lot of Holocaust survivors in Israel who were very, very poor. And so in theory, the reparations should have helped make their lives easier, but somehow that didn't seem to happen. So I was wondering what what happened there.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I've actually got a slide about it. What happened was, after the war, the money came to Israel in the form of goods. So, you've got these German trains that came into Israel. Some of them are now theaters in Jerusalem. And then eventually, since the war, the Federal Republic of Germany has paid Israel over 3 million marks over 14 years. And in 2007, as of 2007, that's 25 billion euros in reparations to Holocaust survivors, some of who are pictured on the screen here. Israel's Consul General in New York, Ittay, credited the Luxembourg Agreement with ensuring decades of activity of cultivating Holocaust awareness throughout the world and funding JCCs, Jewish museums, all of this sort of stuff that came out of the claims conference, saying that it had, a very positive impact on the ability of Jews to keep the memory of the Shoah alive. And then also in 2012, Germany also agreed to pay reparations to victims from the USSR as well. So in response to your question, a lot of the most destitute Holocaust survivors in Israel are people that came from the former USSR. Many of these survivors are sadly living in poverty today. And this money does go to them. It's a very, very small stipend. It's not enough, to be honest. And it's also something that's only been paid since 2012. And the process of getting these reparations is very complicated. You have to find a lot of, obscure documents that sometimes elderly people are not able to do. I obviously want every Holocaust survivor to live in dignity and to have food on the table and to have heating and cooling and, all of those sorts of things. And it's something we need to do better on. I think the reparations made a small difference, but not enough.
Jerry, I think, is raising his hand.
Comment. I'm the son of Holocaust survivors, and your question about where I would fall on this argument is I would definitely be in favor of the reparations. My parents came to Canada in 1948 after the war, and it was a struggle for them. And I didn't even know until my father passed away that he was actually getting a pension from the German government. But I think that made a difference.
Can I ask, just Jerry, just on your personal experience, how did your grandfather feel taking money from people that caused so much hurt to his family? Did you ever talk to him about?
It was my father, not my.
Your father, sorry, yeah.
My father. I don't know. I didn't even know he was getting it until he died, so I can't really tell you how he felt about it.
Yeah.
I only found out about it, after he died, that you had to go to the bank and say tell them that the pension had to stop. But so I honestly don't know. My father was one of the survivors who almost never talked about the war at all.
Yeah.
So I don't really know how he felt about it, but I am pretty sure that we wouldn't hardly have been able to survive. It was probably a meaningful part of their income, and which I never even knew about. But we were able to help to buy a house and have a more or less middle class type income.
Yeah.
So I personally I would have been very much in favor of it.
Thank you for sharing that.
So I can see we now have a couple more hands raised, but I just want to read you a comment that was sent to me on the chat, and then we'll move on to the others. So I received a comment that said, during that time, I went to some of the demonstrations, in part out of curiosity, since my father didn't want to accept, while other family members did. I could understand all perspectives. Even though father had his specific position, he encouraged debate about it in the family.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So I believe the next person was Diana. I'm trying my best to keep track of who raised their hand when. My apologies if I didn't get that right. Diana, are you unmuted? I think
Yes, but it's,
okay.
can you hear me now? It keeps telling
Yes.
me, anyway.
Yes.
Please, Ittay, tell me if I'm straying too much, but the issue of reparations is making me think about other wars and other countries that have perpetrated horrors on each other. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking of the Vietnam War, I'm thinking also of any kind of, with Americans and what happened there. I'm also thinking of, within the context that we're talking about, have there been reparations from Poland, from Austria, from other countries in Europe that participated to a considerable degree together with Germany? So I don't know if you want to respond to all of that, but on this particular issue of reparations and what that means in terms of revenge and blood money, it's a very tricky question. I happen to be of the view, as far as Israel is concerned, that what you described in terms of where the money has gone, as well as to the individuals, a very small amount to most individuals, that it was very much, appropriate. But do you care to respond to the rest, or is that something which is too?
Yeah. I'll respond to the best of my knowledge. It's not a huge area of my expertise because I teach Jewish history. I'm not familiar with all those other genocides. But what I can say is I definitely know. Look, let's say after South Africa, when they ended apartheid, there wasn't payments made to the Black South Africans, but they did have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was problematic, but it also gave justice to a certain extent. But a lot of the perpetrators of the crime of apartheid weren't necessarily held to account as long as they sort of apologized for what they did. But for some people, that was cathartic. I know in the United States now, I think I have heard that some states are talking about reparations for slavery. I don't know if that's a mainstream movement. Probably the Americans on this call can fill me in on that a bit more. In Rwanda, I'm not aware of any payments, but I do know that they had courts again for some sort of reconciliation process. I don't know of that happening in Cambodia after the genocide there. So I think it really depends on the situation, if the victims want to receive the money or not, if the perpetrators are willing to pay or not, if the perpetrators are still in power, if they're still alive. There's different cases. I think in the case of Nazi Germany, what makes it unique is that not only was there a genocide, there's the physical murder of people, but there was also an enormous seizing of property, an enormous amount of slave labor. You know, the genocide of the Holocaust went for 6 years or 13 years if you want to go from the rise of Hitler. And during that time, you know, millions of Jews worked without pay in slave labor camps and were never paid salaries for that work. So a lot of that benefited Germany, benefited German companies, benefited German technology. And so I think there's a very strong case for reparations in that case due to the nature of that war crime.
Thanks. So let's go next to Sandy.
Hi, thank you. So my question goes along with the reparations, kind of part two of that. Did the fact of the reparations make it influence at all the decision by the Israeli government when the country was starting up to buy engines and bus engines and so on for Egged buses? Because I know that people then Jewish people were not buying any product German, any Germany made product. And yet when I remember hearing that buses were made in Germany or bus parts were coming from there, somehow Israel had moved on and moved into the future and thought that was good. That was business. That was buying the best piece of equipment. So did the reparations influence that at all, that decision?
So I think there's a very big difference between Israel and diaspora. I can say I grew up in Australia where overwhelmingly in Melbourne, the community is very much a Holocaust survivor community. And there was, you know, people would not buy a German fridge, not buy a German car. You know, that was very common for survivors. I'm guessing that may have been common in the United States as well, maybe for some older generation until today. I mean, that's certainly not the case in Israel. Today, Israel trades very heavily with Germany. In fact, even now during this Gaza war, probably one of the most supportive countries of Israel's right to defend herself has been Germany. Whether you agree with that war or not is another question. But in terms of countries that are supportive of the Jewish state, I think it's rare to find another country in Europe, perhaps Austria as well, that are as supportive of the current Israeli government as you would find in Germany. And they also passed the anti-BDS law as well, which came with a lot of controversy too. So yeah, I don't know of today, aside from people, you know, who are very elderly and have obviously memories directly from World War II of people sort of Jews still actively boycotting German product as a movement. I think it's quite a fringe phenomenon today, but it used to be a lot more widespread, mainstream. Yeah.
Thanks, Sandy. Ellen, I think you're next.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to say my father-in-law was in Auschwitz, and we were in Canada and now we're in the States, and he received reparations. But one thing that's very troubling is that when he died at a relatively young age, the reparations stopped, even though my mother-in-law hid in Europe and was a displaced person because she actually wasn't in a camp. She didn't continue to receive the reparations. So the money wasn't for families who often were very impoverished. And I think that's a very troubling piece of the story. And the other piece I wanted to say is that I agree about payment or equity or justice, an act of justice, an act of, but not an act of somehow fixing, as you said, like the language of this is important. And the States is considering, there are people considering what will happen in terms of African Americans and Indigenous people. And I think it's a good conversation to have. Who knows what will happen, but I think it's a worthy conversation.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And
Sure.
may your parents have a long life as well. Jerry. Jerry, would you like to unmute? Yeah.
I didn't really have anything extra to add, but I do agree with Ellen's comments there. And I saw some of the comments in the chat that the Germans did take responsibility, and going back to your earlier question about the Germans, I did know my father was fine with me buying German speakers. I remember when I was in my 20s. He was fine with that, and he said they make the best quality products, so no problem. The war is over, so maybe he was okay with receiving the reparations in that respect. And also, when you think about it, both Canada and the United States have a big black mark on us with not accepting the ships that tried to come over during the war and refusing to accept as refugees, and they had to be sent back, and many died in the camps. I think that's a big black mark on both countries.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I want to highlight, just in the time we have left, two other protests that I want to sort of contrast with this protest. Okay. So Israel also has an asylum seeker issue, which I'm sure many of you would be aware of, that in the last decade, over 50,000 refugees from Eritrea and Sudan have come to Israel seeking protection against what they feel are war crimes being committed in Sudan and Eritrea. And Israel's had this dilemma of whether to allow them or not. On the one hand, Israel is a state of refugees, and it's clearly welcomed in millions of refugees from all over the world. But on the other hand, it's a Jewish state, and these are non-Jewish refugees. And there was a dilemma of whether to allow in these non-Jewish refugees or not. The minister at the time in 2012 held a rally against these people, calling them infiltrators and illegal workers. Miri Regev said that they are a cancer in our society, and all the leftists who have filed high court appeals against deportations should be ashamed of themselves. So, this was the view of the Likud at the time, and it's still the view today, that Israel is a Jewish state and it should care for Jewish interests. It shouldn't be a state that cares about non-Jewish refugees, because there's other countries in the world that could do that, and Israel should care about Jewish interests first. Dani Damnon from the Likud, who eventually became Israel's ambassador in the UN, he said the infiltrators are a national plague and we must deport them immediately before it's too late. The speech goes on and talks about crime and rape and all of these sorts of things that these people bring into the country, and that therefore we shouldn't have them here. Eventually, these sort of speeches led to a race riot in Israel in 2012. where over 1,000 people attended a demonstration and then ended up smashing windows of the cars that belonged to these illegal workers, asylum seekers, depending on your view. And there was a huge protest that started to allow them to stay in response. And these protesters were mainly Jews on the left in Israel, obviously, who felt very uncomfortable about the history of, what I just talked about, of us being a nation of Holocaust survivors, sort of turning our back on people in times of need. And one of the protests that I want to talk about that I found very interesting was Shaul Betzer. Shaul Betzer is a pilot with El Al. El Al is the national airline of Israel. And he was ordered to fly these refugees to Rwanda because Israel had struck up a deal with Rwanda that the refugees would be expelled to that country. And this is what he said in a Facebook post that later on went viral about that. Maybe Ellen, if you're able to unmute yourself, are you happy to read this quote for me of what Shaul Betzer said about this situation?
I am a part of the Jewish people. I was someone who was raised and educated with Zionist values that renewed the existence of our nation and the land of Israel. I'm someone that has lived here his entire life, who has taken part in missions behind enemy lines, which required no small amount of courage and belief in the justice of our path, recognition of Jewish morality, and the sanctity of every human being, all in order to ensure ourselves and generations to come that we will never again be refugees and reliant on the goodness of others. There is no way that as part of the flight crew, I will take part in flying asylum seekers or refugees on their way to a destination in which their chance of survival after arrival to a third country is close to zero. Not much courage is required for such a mission, but I will not be able to do what is required of me in such a mission as a pilot and as a human being. January 21, 2018.
Thank you. So in the first protest we looked at Menachem Begin and Ben-Gurion talking about what is the essence of a Jewish state. Should we accept these reparations from Germany? And here we're talking really about what is the character of a Jew in the Jewish state, and what does it mean that now that we have, this was written 10 years ago, but now that we have a state that's arguably one of the most powerful states in the Middle East with a strong army, do we need to continue acting in a way that we fear, this immigration of 50,000 people from Sudan and Eritrea because they're not Jewish? And should we act to remove them and fly them back to their countries? Eventually, the courts actually ruled that flying the asylum seekers to Rwanda was illegal because Rwanda didn't agree to it and Uganda didn't agree to it. So many of the refugees actually ended up staying unless they left of their own will, but there are still issues with that. And then the last issue that I want to look at in terms of protest is the issue of weapon sales. So Israel is a country that still sells many weapons to the countries all over the world. Weapon sales is one of Israel's largest industries. And some of the countries we sell to here, you can see the chief of command of the IDF, Gadi Eisenkot, with the chief of the military of Myanmar. Countries that I think many people would raise questions about Israel meeting with, let alone selling weapons to. And the Israel's Consul General Deputy in New York, when he was asked about this, he said that Israel sells weapons to Myanmar because ethnic cleansing is committed on both sides, and so therefore Israel shouldn't be responsible for what happens there with the weapons that we make. And the same thing in South Sudan as well. There's been allegations that Israel was selling weapons to Rwanda as well at the time of the genocide there. There's a news report from 2009 of war crimes being committed in Cameroon, again with Israeli weapons, and many other countries that purchase Israeli cybersecurity technology and then use that to spy on the LGBT communities in their country and democracy movements. That all comes from Israeli creations. In 2018, Rodrigo Duterte from the Philippines visited the president of Israel, Ruby Rivlin, and he was interviewed about this question of weapons, and he said he'll only buy Israeli weapons because there are no restrictions on those weapons. is from the Times of Israel, an Israeli newspaper, quoting this, saying, in a country where I think many people would view this person as a war criminal or not someone that should be honored by the president of the country, he claims he very clearly and explicitly to buy weapons to use against the people in the Philippines who he considers to be criminals. And so there's been a lot of protests about this. Interestingly, a lot of them coming from the right in Israel, from the B'nai Akiva movement, which is a religious Zionist movement, said that they called on Israel to stop these weapon sales to countries that commit mass murder. This was the resolution that they passed about that. There's a man named Eli Yosef who does this sort of like one-man protest against the selling of weapons, really trying to make it an election issue. He actually ran in the last Knesset. I think he got about 500 votes, so he didn't get into the Knesset. But he feels very passionately that Israel should learn the lessons of World War II and do whatever possible that whilst we should thrive and prosper as a country, we shouldn't be profiting from the sale of weapons. And so you can see here the various protests that he does to try and stop weapon sales. He even confronted Benny Gantz at one point at his campaign launch, again, raising this issue of Benny Gantz's time in the army and his involvement in weapon sales as well. And so I guess now we're in this situation where there's a lot of questions that come up from all three of these protests that I want to leave you with tonight. The first is, in what ways does the Shoah obligate Israel to behave in a way that's different from other nations? Does this fact that we were formed as a country based on the ashes of the Holocaust in 1948, and where so many of the founders of the early people who came here were survivors and also refugees from Arab countries, and the people that established the state before came fleeing pogroms in Europe. Should that obligate us to act in a different way? Is the survival of Israel the highest purpose, or is the moral behavior of Israel the highest purpose? In taking reparations, what price does Israel pay for its survival? Should Israel sell arms to the highest bidder? Is making profit from weapons more important than the stain this puts on Israel's reputation? And is a tiny nation justified in strict enforcement of borders, or should we be merciful to all refugees? And each of these protests raises different questions and gives different answers. And you can probably, as you look at these questions, I'm sure you probably immediately have answers that you want to share, whether you agree or disagree with these things. But the point of what I was trying to do tonight was really to show you that teaching Israel through protests is very different to teaching Israel through wars or through political terms of office or something like that. Because once you start looking at this country through the lens of protests, you touch on really the most core and fundamental issues about who we are as a nation and the kind of people we want to be. And to bring that back to what's happening now, we're in a civil war now between Jews and Arabs, and we're also in a very violent war with Hamas, with all these rocket attacks. And now I think in the diaspora, and I think many people that care for Israel, their main concern is defense, is ending this war, is stopping these rockets and resuming to so-called normal life. But what is normal life? What is normal life when you have an ongoing occupation, when you have discrimination, when you have these questions of reparations, when you have all of these unresolved questions about who we are and who we want to be as a nation? And as someone that, again, I made Aliyah 3 years ago, I chose to make Jerusalem my home. I have 2 young children who live here. And I want this place to be a place where everyone can live with justice and equality. But I also want my Jewish liberal values to be represented in the government. And while I acknowledge that I'm a minority, I think a lot of these protests bring up very troubling questions about the nature and the direction of Israel in the modern world. And to finish with a quote from Rich Cohen before I open for questions, he says, "It's a great irony that Israel was more secure as an idea than it's ever been as a nation with an army. The creation of modern Israel has changed what it means to be a Jew anywhere. Jews everywhere had to reset their compasses. There was no way to exercise power without diminishing yourself. It's the price of sovereignty, and it's the hidden cost of Zionism." And my plea, I guess now, maybe this is more of a tefillah, is that Israel, I'm happy that we have sovereignty. I'm happy that we have a state, and I hope that we can assert our Zionism and our sovereignty in a way that honors the humanity that exists within every human being, and especially every human being within the borders of Israel today. So with that, I will say thank you, and I've got like about 10 minutes left for any questions and comments, and so please ask.
So I'm sure that we will start to get questions in a minute. Please feel free to raise your hand if you have any. There was a question earlier just asking if you could share a little bit more about Kids for Peace and if it's active right now.
So Kids for Peace is a youth movement for Israelis and Palestinians from East and West Jerusalem. I've been working there for the past 3 years. It's not active now due to, there was a Muslim festival last week called Eid al-Fitr, and today it's Shavuot. And we were meant to resume our programs next week. I can't honestly say that we will. I don't think we're going to run programs if the country is still at war and parents are not safe to send their children out of the house. Maybe we'll do things on Zoom, I don't know. But I had a meeting with my staff last week, and we'll meet again next week. But it's always hard to run a peace organization in Jerusalem, but now it's like 100 times more difficult. I very much believe in the power of encounter and of dialogue. You know, one of the first things I did when I moved to Jerusalem was I joined a dialogue group with Haredim, with ultra-Orthodox Jews, because I thought this is a group that I don't know at all, and I have to talk to them and understand them because I have to live in this city with them. And I believe the same thing about East and West Jerusalem. You know, this is an entirely segregated city. There's Jewish schools and there's Arab schools. There's about one school that has kids from both. There are Jewish buses, there are Arab buses. There are Jewish neighborhoods, there are Arab neighborhoods. There's a wall that goes through the city. I can see Yad B'Yad. I know Yad B'Yad, we have some kids from Yad B'Yad at Kids for Peace. It's a school I very much support. And our youth movement sort of runs very much like that. The difference is that the hand-in-hand school is a school. You know, it's a 9 to 5 school where kids go to school. We're a youth movement, meaning that kids come after school. And the reason we exist as an after-school program, and we also have summer camps and all of those sorts of things, is to give the kids an opportunity to, especially kids that would otherwise never meet someone from the other side, maybe don't speak Hebrew or Arabic. You know, we have translators that translate all 3 languages, that they can still come together. And I think that's very important. I believe in the power of humanity to overcome hatred and violence. I think a lot of what we talk about now is social media. You know, a lot of what happens in Jerusalem now is a direct consequence of incitement that happens on social media. You know, you can jump on any social media platform in this city and see horrific videos of violence that cause a lot of people to be angry, often edited out of context to what caused them, what happened before or after them. This is both Israelis and Palestinians do this. And when you don't have a friend, when you don't have someone that you can meet and talk to on the other side, then your hatred of them seems a lot more justified because you can't really put a face or a name to your enemy. So I believe in what we do. I believe in it a bit less now, to be honest, if I'm speaking from my heart, because I feel a little bit like we failed, like the fact that the country is so on fire and there's so many peace organizations here that do good work, but we clearly weren't able to prevent this. And I think we really need to reevaluate how we operate and why we do what we do. But I don't see any other way to live together other than meeting and talking and accepting that everyone has to be at home here. But I'm a minority here. I'm not the majority of this country.
Thanks. We do have a few questions, but if people are interested in learning more about the organization, how would they do that?
I'll put their website in the
Terrific.
In the chat, and I'll put my email as well. And you're welcome to email me. I do presentations about Kids for Peace as well, so I'm happy to talk to you about that as well.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to, while you do that, I'm going to unmute our first person who's going to ask a question, and that's Michael.
Hi, great talk. I, in the past, have worked as a computer teacher in Jewish day schools. And one of the parts of that has interested me is a program called Flight Simulator, where you get to fly planes. And when you talked about the pilot, it interested me because, one of you see on the web that some of the Israelis who play this game, one of the missions that they sort of played around with is flying the Jews from Ethiopia, I think it was Ethiopia, to Israel, when there was that migration. So on the one hand, you'd have a mission that, has all kinds of steps or whatever. And then in your case, what in theory, if you ask the students, would you do this, would you not, would be the shortest mission in the history of, playing the game. So it's just interesting the role of pilots in Israeli society historically and in real time, and how you see them, being ethical participants in both, that airlift, and then in this case, an airlift that I think did not happen.
No, this one didn't happen. No, yeah. Look, I don't have much to say beyond the quote that was shared by Shaul Betzer, but I do think, a pilot is never just flying a plane. There's always other moral responsibilities, and I think it's important that our pilots are trained to be aware of that it's not just a normal job. Beyond that, I don't have much to add, but happy to go to the next question, but thank you for asking.
So I'm going to go to Judith.
Hi, I was raising my hand for Yudi, who has had his hand up, his physical hand up the whole time. And I'm not sure if he knows how to put the virtual hand up. So if you could call on him.
Okay, I will do that. So Yudi, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Oh, wow, Judith, God bless you. And thank you so much, my advocate. And I'm an IT guy, so I should be able to figure this out, but long story. Thanks so much, Ittay, for the great lecture. I'm a son of a survivor also. I remember the check that came every month from the German national, whatever the bank, German Deutsche, some long German name. So my father got a civil service pension for his service to the army on the Eastern Front as a slave laborer. He had no qualms taking it. He was a religious Jew, an Orthodox religious Jew. He had no qualms taking it. What I'm missing from this lecture is clearly Menachem Begin represented some huge passion that I just don't get. There must have been some huge emotion that it just doesn't resonate with me. And if he was willing to go to civil war, what about it was so damning? Or might it have been politics? Might it have been Menachem Begin being a little, using it as a.
No, it's a really good question.
He was trying to use it as a cudgel to bash.
No, I think Begin was genuine, and I think that the issue here, if I had to summarize it in 2 words, it's Jewish pride. I have a whole lecture I give on revisionist Zionism and the Beitar movement, but you can't really understand it without understanding the concept of Jabotinsky's writing and the notion of that the whole purpose of Zionism was to make Jews feel proud and strong as a nation. And Begin, it's not like he didn't want the money, it wasn't about money. It was about that notion of, now that we're in the independent state, and even though it was only 6 years into the state, there was that notion of this was shaming the honor of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and the thing that the state of Israel should do more than anything, even if it's not in our interests, even if it's going to harm us to not have this money, we have to stand up for Jewish honor and Jewish pride. And when issues of pride and honor come up, people don't think rationally. I know a lot of people that I can give you hundreds of examples of people that commit obscene acts of violence in the name of protecting the honor of a brother, of a sister, of a loved one. And they're not rational things. And I don't think, to me, I supported the reparations, and Begin also seems a bit irrational to me, but I sort of get his thing, because if you're from that mindset of Jewish pride and honor are the most important things in the world, then you can do a lot of irrational things. I mean, he stormed the entire Knesset. This is a January 6th moment in Israel. In fact, when January the 6th happened, which was obviously horrifying, I'm sure, for many Americans, but many Israeli like journalists actually started talking about the Menachem Begin protests, saying, it's happened here too. You can see here a story, with a picture of the capital, comparing the two cases, looking at the similarities and differences. There was also an article in the Jewish Chronicle comparing the two cases. So, the notion of honor is something that that can inspire these acts sometimes. That's how I'd explain it. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we are at time. So I want to thank you, Ittay, for really an excellent session, 2 excellent sessions. I learned so much, and I know that others did as well. I want to thank everyone who has been with us this evening for this current events track.